All right, so in this unit, we're going to talk about the history of graphic design and just kind of art in general and how we got to where we are today. This is a very, very shallow and brief overview of all of these different art movements and time periods, and we're going to go really quickly through them. So, if we're going to skip over stuff, we're going to miss things, we're going to not talk about certain artists, and it's not because they're not important that we're leaving them out. We just don't have a whole lot of time to dedicate to it. I mean, if you really want to dig into art history, it's a semester long or sometimes a year long class to really get into it. But my hope is that through this, it'll give you a general idea of how graphic design started, how it evolved, and maybe give you some ideas or help point you to some art movements or artists or time periods that kind of grab your attention and that you'll dig into yourself and maybe research a little bit more as you do some projects in the future. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start before graphic design, right from the beginning. And we're going to start with kind of like the invention of writing. So early human markings were found in Africa in 35,000 BC. So long, long time ago. They had animals, geometric signs, pictographs. They're very elementary sketches to represent certain things. They're almost like early thumbnail sketches, things that we'll be talking about throughout this class of just quick, simple little sketches to give you an idea of something or to just give you a visual reference of something. You might even see this nowadays as well too. If you look at like our apps and even just symbols that we use in icons to represent certain things on menus when you're driving around, or like I said, on apps on your phone, we use simple basic shapes to communicate stuff. So it's the same concept. It was used way before writing comes in, but it's just a way to communicate with people because you can communicate a lot more through a picture than you can through words sometimes. So pictures are a great way to do that. And they've been doing it for over 35,000 years. Evolution into writing symbols for spoken language. And then at 2800 BC, they started writing from left to right and from top to bottom. So there became a format to writing. It wasn't just kind of squares in different areas. It was just kind of had a nice flow to it, which is what we commonly see today of left to right and top to bottom. And they used a sharp stylus trying to like a triangle shape to create these different graphics, these different symbols. It was what was called a cuneiform writing style. And then we have Egyptian hieroglyphics. So same concept using symbols, but now they're starting to look a little bit like what we might say are letters. This image you see here to the right is called the Rosetta Stone. You may have heard of the computer program Rosetta Stone, where you can learn a bunch of languages. This is where the idea comes from. This stone, if you look at it, it's the same story, but it's written in multiple languages. So you can see it's a little bit bigger on the top. In the middle, it gets a little bit smaller. In the bottom, it's like a smaller format. So it's multiple languages writing the same story. So that's where that idea of the Rosetta Stone comes from. Then it kind of transitioned into papyrus writing. It's a paper made from plants. And then we get into illustrative manuscripts. So you can kind of see the progression of where things kind of go from there. In Asia, they had a huge contribution to writing, and it's still seen today, but Chinese calligraphy in 1800 BC. Calligraphy characters are called logograms, and they're graphic signs, and they represent entire words. They are really kind of the essence of like the icons that we see today in graphic design, logos that we see in graphic design, right? We have this simple logo, and it represents this whole company or this whole business. But with calligraphy, Chinese calligraphy, it actually means a whole word. So each of those symbols is a word instead of just a single letter. So it's a beautifully artistic way of creating writing and also communicating. Paper was kind of invented in 105 AD from a natural substance, from like pulp and things like that, commonly a little bit more of what we see in our work today. And then they had relief printing to make stamps and then ink rubbings as well. And then movable type was first used actually by Asian cultures, but it wasn't very widespread. Because of the way their style was, movable print wasn't really usable just yet. So their handwriting version of it, the handwriting calligraphy, is actually more beneficial for their writing style. And then we get into the alphabet, or what we commonly know today as the alphabet. So Greece and Rome is kind of where it started. And you can see by this little graphic down below there, we've got Cretan pictographs in 2800 BC and then Phoenician alphabet in 2000 BC. It's the earliest known alphabet. then the Greek alphabet in 1000 BC, and then the Latin alphabet in 750 BC. And you can see how by the Latin alphabet, we start to recognize the symbols as the common letters that we use today. And I love this graphic because it shows the progression of the symbols into what we commonly know as the letters today. So looking at the letter A, it says almost looks like a K, right? And then they kind of flip it and move it around by the early Greeks, and then Latin cleans it up, and then modern Latin kind of makes it what it is today. That modern Latin line is our current alphabet, what we see today. But you can really see the connections in some of the letters and how they've been simplified. I like the H letter as well too. It looks almost like a crooked ladder by the Phoenicians, and then it's straightened out, it's simplified, and it's simplified even more, and now it is what we see today. So really unique, really interesting to see how some of that has translated and evolved over the years. And then we're jumping to medieval times. This is after the fall of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was one of the great empires of our time. Then it fell, and then we come into the medieval era, and then we have these manuscripts. It's known as the medieval time is known as the Dark Ages, but it produced a lot of rich and colorful designs, even though it was considered the Dark Ages. And this example on the right shows that. So they used really colorful designs. Christian monasteries created illuminated manuscripts. So they were handwritten, but they were embellished with gold and silver. So they had these embellished designs and illustrations with gold leaf and silver leaf to put in there to make it more religious and sacred with those types of things. And then you even get Celtic book design in 700 AD. So you get these ornamental frames around portraits. So opening pages of the Bible, of the Gospels. So they would have these decorative designs. And that picture on the right is a good example of that. You've got this picture of the apostle or an apostle who wrote a specific book in the Bible, and then they got the little ornate border around it. So introducing that book with an illustration. So what I'd like you to do now is take a quick break, and I want you to answer this question. Each of the time periods and cultures played a huge role in the evolution and growth of communication, both visually and in written form. So in the Padlet link in Canvas, you're going to write a response to the following question. Which of these early movements do you think had the greatest impact on our communication? And why do you think so? Don't worry about that little link at the bottom there. Just kind of ignore that. If you go back to Canvas, there will be a link there that says early impact. And that's where you're going to go and find that link to the Padlet. So again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just you looking at what we just saw and understanding kind of like identifying yourself, like what do you think had the greatest impact on what we see today? So go ahead and hit pause and jump on that. Okay, we're going to move on to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a pretty well-known art movement. A lot of change. It was right after medieval times. It's kind of Enlightenment period came in, and people started to dig into education more and learn about science and math, and they began to apply that to art. And you'd see some really mathematically drawn and perfectly drawn just paintings and drawings in general. They'd use perspective. One-point perspective was invented, and three-dimensional aspects were more realistic looking now in paintings instead of flat, kind of like the Egyptian style. In printing, though, we had a lot of that kind of print arrive. So it wasn't just hand-drawn stuff anymore. Now they'd figured out, how do we take these drawings and put them in a print format? The value of a book was equal to a farm or a vineyard. So this is really important to think about. A book that was handwritten was the same cost of an entire farm or vineyard. That's how rare books were before printing came along. So printing was a huge shift in our culture, in our world altogether in terms of mass communication. So typography, printing through the use of independent and reusable pieces of metal or wood, that is what typography basically is. So it started out with wood or metal pieces. They'd carve the letters, they'd shift them around in little plates, and then they would print those. So now with printing, those earlier books, they were handwritten, there's more of a demand for them. They're easier to make. So wealthy merchants created assembly lines of craftsmen to create books, right? So now they've got these people, they're making an assembly line, and they're creating these really like ornate books, and they're making multiple copies, and it's going much quicker than it used to when it was handwritten. And here's a really cool example of a woodblock print playing card. So this was kind of the first artistic piece that was made with a woodblock print, was playing cards. And here's a fun fact. The suits of the playing cards, so diamonds, clubs, spades, and hearts, they actually represent different classes in medieval society. So a heart represented the clergy, or like the religious people. The spades was the nobility, kind of the smarter, whatever, wise people of that time. A club represented the peasantry, so kind of like the lower class people there. And the diamonds were like the privileged citizens. So as these playing cards are going around, each suit represented a different class of people in that time period. So pretty interesting fact. And then we get into movable type. So now we get into a little bit more mass production. So economic and multiple production of alphabetic communications. In 1422, 122 manuscripts were in the library at Cambridge. And then came the Gutenberg press, which you see over to the right. And that was around 1455. It came complete with calligraphies and imitated their styles. Each character in font had to be engraved into a steel bar to make a punch. So a punch is what the letters were that would be printed on the paper. So they had to be carved individually. But once you carved that, you could reuse it. And that was the really cool thing. A type mold was created, particular alloy with perfect composition to hold up to thousands of impressions, but soft enough to mold. So it was soft enough that they could move it around, but hard enough that it could be pressed 1,000 times and not lose its form. So it could have a lot of force going behind it. If you look at this diagram there, so this little thing that's kind of leaning back, that's where you'd put, that's kind of like the cover that goes over it. You'd put the piece of paper down, and underneath that paper was all those little blocks, those type molds, and they would roll this sticky ink on it, put the paper on, put that flap down, slide it in, and then you can see that little handle that's there. They would have some big dude just grab that and pull that handle and press all of that down, and it would press the ink onto the paper. They'd let it go, pull it out, and just like that, you'd have a printed document. So not the greatest quality image, but this is an example of the Gutenberg Bible. This is like the first Bible that was printed. It's a 42-line form. 180 copies were made of this Bible, and only 60 still exist today. So that's quite a few, actually, for that long ago. But you can see it was very tightly packed, had some nice big spacing in there, but now things could be mass produced. Now printing continues to grow. So there's German illustrated books, is the cradle period, the cradle or period of early printing throughout the 15th century. Printing spread through Europe. They reduced the price to a fraction of a manuscript. So remember, we talked about a manuscript cost the price of a field. Well, now because you're printing and I can make multiple copies, it doesn't cost as much anymore. So what happens to that? Social, religious, and economic upheavals were most influenced and weren't advanced until mass communication. So now you have people being educated. They are able to spread ideas. Illiteracy starts to disappear, and learning education grows because more and more people have access to books and to literature and writings. So really interesting stuff. And then we roll into the graphic design style of the Renaissance period. So the Italian Renaissance, they used type design, page layout, ornaments, illustrations, and total design were all reimagined in this era. So everything, they just thought of it in a new, different way and just applied it, which is really interesting. So they had wider letter forms, tighter tone, and an even texture throughout. Wildflowers and vines, and border and elements. So you can see over on the bottom right there, that letter G with all that floral decorative design with it. That was pretty common in the Renaissance graphic design era. So Renaissance had this philosophy called humanism, and it was this philosophy of human dignity and worth that defined a man as capable of using reason and scientific inquiry to achieve self-meaning and understanding in the world. And that's what drove their design style, is this is clean, scientific, and pure design. And then we talk about Claude Garamond. He's had a lighter typeface design, and he wanted a clarity of font, and he eliminated the Gothic style. So before the Renaissance, it was very ornate Gothic style. When you think of like Old English style font, it was a little bit harder to read. So his thought was, I want to simplify this, make it cleaner, and make it easier to read. He was a typeface designer and a punch cutter in the 1500s, and he's credited with eliminating Gothic style due to its sheer quality in as many fonts. So you guys, if you open up Microsoft Word and you go into the fonts, you will probably see a font called Garamond, and it's named after this man. And we're actually going to see several fonts that we still use today that people invented. Before we do that, you're going to do another kind of little in your notebook pair share activity. So you're going to look back at the Renaissance printing that we've discussed, and I want you to write down what is a similarity you see and what is a difference you see. Okay. So I'm going to give you, well, have some time to write that. Go ahead and pause the video here. In Canvas, you're going to see there's a discussion bar that says think, write, pair share. Okay. So you're going to write your response to each of these questions in that little discussion. And then you're also going to respond to at least one other student's response in there. So if you see something different than them, awesome. Ask them a question about it or point out something that you saw that maybe they didn't catch, but you're just going to have a little bit of a dialogue with your classmates. So go ahead and hit pause right here, jump back onto Canvas, and let's look at that discussion panel. Okay, and now we're going to talk a little bit about typography. So because of the printing press, we have what's called the dawn of type. So now typography becomes a big thing. With all this printing, they can redesign it and they can customize it to communicate a lot of different things. So the quality of printing, due to the mathematical process, there's fewer calligraphic properties, meaning like embellishments and things like that. So they kind of simplified a lot of it. So grids over 2,000 squares were used to design a capital letter. So if you ever look at the grid to design a capital letter, like literally to draw it out, it's a very tiny, tiny little squares and grids. So it was very mathematical. It was very precise. These weren't just guys hand drawing letters and saying, oh, that looks nice. They were very mathematical about how they created their letters. They wanted to be perfect and have a nice weight to it and look and feel and have a legibility and clarity to it. So all these fonts that you see were very intentionally designed. They weren't just put together. So we kind of take it for granted with our computers these days. We can just click a font, change it, and that's it. But there was a lot of work that went into creating these originally. William Caslon, born 1692 to 1776, he created what was called an old style. In the 1700s, it was used solely by English printing, and even Ben Franklin introduced it into America because he said it was pleasing to the eye. John Baskerville from 1706 to 1775, he liked wide margins and used a lot of space and used a smooth, glossy paper in his design. So his design is over there to the right at the bottom. You can see a little bit of wider margin on the left and right side. And he uses space really well. So some of his fonts are really small and some of them are big, and it moves around quite a bit. Then you have a modern type style. And Mr. Bedoni, you'll probably see that as well in your Microsoft Word or Illustrator, 1740 to 1890. His typeface is inspired by classical forms of Greek and Roman art. So if you think of columns from the Greek and Roman temples, and then you look at his font style over to the right there, you can see it has a very kind of architectural feel to it, very straight lines horizontally and vertically. So what he did with he had a more mathematical geometric appearance, thin strokes, straight hairlines, serifs. So remember, we talked about serifs are the tails that you see on a letter. So his were very straight. They didn't have any curves coming into them. They were just kind of straight hairlines, very thin. Bedoni took a leadership role in evolving new typefaces and page layouts. His page layouts removed the decorative ornaments and borders that he felt were too much. They didn't serve a purpose and a function and efficiency, especially in the printing process. So he got rid of a lot of that. So his open, simple page design had a lot of generous margins with wide letters. And you can see that in that example there. There's a lot of open space, big letters. You got maybe a small little border there, but very minimalistic, very simple and to the point. And then you have the Didot family, and they're a dynasty of printers. They started in 1730 to the 1840s. They had thin and fat styles of font. And then Furman did a stereotype printing. It's made longer press runs possible, which was a pretty cool invention. Then the typeface period. So we have the old style period, a typeface based on 18th century design. It's distinguished by irregularities and slanted ascenders, serifs, little contrast. So a Garamond and Caslon would be considered an old style. A transitional typeface would be more of your Baskerville or your Times Roman, right? And then your modern fonts are your Bedoni. Those are a little bit thicker. They have kind of like it says there, they tend to have more character or attitude than the old style and transitionals, but they still carry a certain amount of dignity and formality. So if you think of Bedoni's, It didn't look very crazy, but because of the way it was structured with the hairline serifs and the clean vertical lines, it had a little bit of character and attitude to it that you don't see in maybe some of the more curved aspects of the old style and the transitional styles of font. And then we start to see even more things come out. We've got the slab serif. So you've got this New Century School Book, and then the sans serif, which is now they take the tails off of the letters altogether. So now you've got a very unique stylistic look to these typefaces, your Arials. And then William Caslon the fourth, so his great grandson there, I think that's it, right? Yeah, great grandson, created the sans serif font. So you can see the Caslon family was making fonts for quite some time. And we're going to jump through this pretty quickly, but just want to introduce you guys to like the linotype. So that machine down in the bottom right corner is called the linotype. It's a typewriter like keys that you type in, and it releases these little pieces there, and those little pieces would then ink up and print on that paper. And that's how they started doing newspapers and things like that. And they could reduce the cost of it because it can go even quicker through the process. So before we kind of wrap up here, one more thing I need you to do in Canvas. I'm going to need you to, it's another little discussion page in there, but you don't need to respond to each other. I just want you to kind of wrap up what you've learned today and think about all the stuff that we've kind of gone through. It's a lot. It was really quick, but you can always go back and play it if you need to. But in your own words, which period that we talked about today do you think had the most impact on our world today? So thinking about what we do today in terms of design, typography, advertisement, products, all that kind of stuff, which period do you think had the most impact and why? Explain your answer a little bit, okay? So go back to Canvas and kind of answer that exit question, and we are done, and I will see you in the next lesson.